All right. I see many people coming in, so I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today. First, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for another TigerStream webinar series. Our August guest speaker is Ben Wegleitner with the Alabama Nature Conservancy. A little bit of background about Ben. He has been with the Nature Conservancy since 2023. Ben's work addresses urban stormwater runoff, aquatic habitat restoration, flood resilience, and the protection of drinking water supplies from multiple environmental stressors in the Birmingham Metro area. Ben has his master's degree in conservation biology and a bachelor's degree in water resources and fisheries management. And without further ado, Ben, I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay, how does that look? Great. Well, thank you again for having me, Matt. Thanks for everyone who's attending. My name is Ben Wegleitner. My role with the Nature Conservancy in Alabama is as urban watershed restoration specialist. And I'll get into, sort of what that means and where conservation and stormwater intersect in just a minute. But just in case you don't know about the Nature Conservancy in general and the Nature Conservancy here in Alabama, TNC is a global conservation organization. We operate in all 50 states and in now 81 countries. Here in Alabama, our focus is threefold. It is healthy waters, and that's generally fresh waters, resilient lands, and a thriving coast. Each of these topic areas are interconnected. Land conservation has a lot to deal with healthy freshwater. Resilient and thriving coasts have a lot to do with the economies and freshwaters that drain to them. And so all of these strategies are well mixed to each other in the form of nature-based solutions, habitat restoration, and ultimately water quality and quantity in our watersheds. At the Nature Conservancy, we work on what we call resilient and connected strategies. So that means linkages between habitats, ecosystems, things like that, for species to use as refugee corridors during the climate crisis that we're in, but also just general migratory patterns. If you look at the Southeast United States, you can tell that the Appalachian corridor is one of the very significant corridors for our mammals, our birds, and our amphibians, and is going to continue to play that role into the future. What we know about freshwater systems and fish is that they can't fly over the top of mountains or move across lands. And so our resilient and connected networks really involves the connectivity of waterways. So stream linkages that are free from barriers like dams, but also things like road crossings and culverts can cause breaks to that linkage in the resilient and connected framework. Other pillars of our freshwater program here in Alabama are focusing on biodiversity and that aquatic connectivity that it requires. Also a big focus on urban stormwater and community resilience. And then more generally and more statewide, we focus a lot of our efforts on floodplain reconnection and the natural flow regimes within these watersheds. So, changing flow regimes, whether that is due to dams or whether that's due to additional or modified stormwater runoff, or the opposite end of the spectrum would be drought conditions that might affect a natural flow regime throughout our state. And so this map is part of our freshwater RCN, or resilient connected networks, of the different watersheds around the state that are resilient, that require protection, or require some amount of restoration in their condition, their flow, or their connections. Being this is an Auburn-based webinar, you may have heard that Alabama is a bit of America's Amazon, particularly when it comes to freshwater taxa. We boast, high levels of biodiversity in our fishes, our mussels, our crayfishes, and that extends to turtles and snails and other aquatic and semi-aquatic species. But this place really is a hotbed for freshwater aquatic biodiversity. And that's part of the reason the Nature Conservancy operates here, is to maintain and restore these habitats and these particular species and taxa. The way we prioritize our work statewide is with a large collaboration with our partners. So state and federal agencies, academic partners like Auburn and Alabama, other nonprofit organizations around the state have gotten together to establish these strategic habitat units or focal areas where we should be working to improve the management or recovery of rare, threatened, and endangered species. We call these highlighted watershed areas strategic habitat units, or SHUs. And these are where we focus our work, where we think we'll get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of restoration of habitats that will benefit either the most species or the most imperiled species, or a multitude of those types of things. I am zoomed in here, but you can see that just around the Birmingham Metro area is the confluence of multiple of these strategic habitat units. In orange in the center of the screen is the Locust Fork of the Black Warrior River. In the darker purple is Big Canoe Creek, which drains to the Middle Coosa. And then the lighter purple that flows south towards Mobile Bay is the Cahaba River. These are three major rivers for the work that we do, but also for the conservation of species in this state. Often when we talk about stormwater, top of mind is what we call construction stormwater, which I'm certain all of you are familiar with, but that is when a site is actively under construction. It is at its highest risk of erosion and sedimentation of our local waterways. So that's when you see things like silt fences, like inlet protection, things like that. And construction stormwater does have a big impact on water quality. It can often add sediment to a lot of these rivers. The big focus of this topic is erosion control, to keep that sediment out of creeks, which interferes with the habitat that all these aquatic species really need to survive and thrive in these watersheds. What we have found from some of the research that the Nature Conservancy and some of our state and federal partners have done is that while sediment from construction sites, from active construction sites, does threaten habitats, it's often a temporary interception or interruption of those habitats. And actually that most of the sediment in our waterways is coming from within those waterways. So erosion of the bank and bed of those rivers due to hydrologic changes, additional stormwater runoff in these rivers, particularly in urban areas, but also in underdeveloped areas, and less so because of construction stormwater and erosion control. We know that's the case because there's been an increased focus on construction stormwater, innovations in silt fencing, in the inlet protection, in erosion control, has really reduced the amount of sediment that's leaving these upland areas that are being developed. And so now the Nature Conservancy is shifting our focus to understanding and dealing with what we call post-construction stormwater. So the new pollutants and runoff volume that comes from developed sites. There are now ordinances in place in most municipalities and most jurisdictions that regulate post-construction stormwater runoff to what they would consider a pre-development rate or magnitude. Best management practices for post-construction stormwater management often includes retention and detention ponds. Those are generally our most common and most conventional post-construction stormwater best management practices. But in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a wider spread adoption of some of these low impact, infiltrative, and at least filtering practices that we would call green infrastructure or low impact development that actually help water get back into the ground, filter through native vegetation, things like that, before reaching our surface water bodies. So on the left is a photo of a permeable paver parking area at a local commercial building used in the parking space. And this post-construction stormwater is really focused on, additional water quality benefits, that filtration that we talked about, but also peak discharge control. So in urban areas, when water runs off of these hard surfaces, these impervious surfaces very quickly, it creates a spike in the water that's in our creeks. And by lowering that spike, by reducing that spike, we're going to have a lot less impact on those rivers and their physical properties, but also the species and the biological processes that happen within those rivers. But that increase in stormwater runoff from our developed areas has a significant impact on on the shape of our streams. So I mentioned that a lot of our erosion is coming from the bank and bed of the streams. This is that process through time. A river in its stable state has access to its floodplains over multiple terraces to spread that additional volume during floods out over the landscape. But as it continues to receive additional volume, additional runoff, we first get head cutting, so erosion of the stream bed downward, which destabilizes the shape of that stream, causes bank failures, collapses like you're seeing in the photos to the right, where the shape of the stream continues to change and reset. And you're getting those additional sediment inputs into those rivers, which is once again filling in some of those habitats. And then over time, that river will restabilize using those new slopes of the banks. We'll be able to reach those floodplains again, but sometimes these processes happen over a very short period of time, depending on how drastic the land use, land cover change is that's driving this. And sometimes it happens over a very, very long period of time that you would really see over, potentially a couple of generations. What the Nature Conservancy is really focused on in terms of post-construction stormwater is using nature-based solutions to help mimic those pre-development processes even just a little bit better, make use of those native plants, those what we call ecosystem services to increase the rate of those benefits for local watersheds. And so with nature-based solutions, in addition to the water quality benefits that you're getting from all of these, stormwater best management practices that we've talked about so far, you're additionally getting some groundwater recharge as that water infiltrates back into the ground and restores some of that natural flow regime. So what we'll talk about in a minute is how that infiltration really affects the natural processes that we're seeing in a stream, even if these practices are happening a good distance from the stream. They don't have to be adjacent to a river. This is an aerial of the Birmingham Metro, or part of the Birmingham Metro. You can see just by the land cover that this would be a landscape under stress. And that plays out in the runoff tendencies that we see in urban areas versus underdeveloped areas, rural areas, things like that, where in those spaces, you get about 50% of the rain that falls infiltrating back into the ground, either in deep infiltration or in some sort of shallow infiltration. Whereas in these urban areas, you get, less than 25% in most situations, infiltration, and the rest goes to mostly runoff, which contributes a lot of that excess volume to rivers. Viewed in another way, we can look at the hydrographs, where in that rural or underdeveloped landscape, it takes a lot longer for discharge to increase over time, because in those areas, water is naturally infiltrating because of trees or prairies or whatever else is out there. And then it takes an amount of time for that ground to be saturated before water starts to run off. So the timing is delayed, and the magnitude of that flood event or of that increase of water in the rivers is much lower. Whereas in the urban space, because a lot of our once infiltrative areas are covered up in concrete or rooftops or whatever that case may be, a lot more of our water runs off. And so it's reaching our rivers quickly. That's that steep slope going up. It reaches a much higher peak discharge. So the magnitude of flooding events, if that river is connected to its floodplain or it's able to reach the floodplain, the height of that flood is much larger. And then it has a very precipitous drop back to what it would call normal. And that's because it's stormwater driven, it's runoff driven. Once that runoff quits, it's going to drop really fast. And so that's going to have an extremely erosive force, just like the slope up did, in reshaping our riverbanks. And then one of the other things we'll talk about in just a minute is that you can tell that darker blue line is much lower than in the rural space, and we'll get into exactly why that is. But you can think of these areas as, the parking lot versus the sponge, and the more we can get our cities, our urban areas, to act more like a sponge, the better we're going to be able to mimic that less developed landscape. And this plays out in USGS gauging data that we have that goes back almost 100 years in the Cahaba River, that we're seeing exactly that increased peak flow, or that top of that peak in urban areas. We're seeing an increase in the rate that those rivers are rising, and also increase in the rate that they're falling. And then there's an increase in that low flow frequency, or how many times that river either goes dry or nearly goes dry. And that has to do a lot with that lack of infiltration. There is less water recharging that groundwater aquifer, which is what drives a lot of our rivers here in the Birmingham Metro area, are spring fed or driven by groundwater. And so when we're not getting that level of infiltration, the base flow of those rivers is lower. And then when we have a drought event, it's more likely that our river will run dry, which means even further disconnection for species that need to move within that habitat, similar to this beautiful tricolored shiner that was taken from the Cahaba River. So again, those increased flows, peak flows or peak discharges, creates an altered flow regime, which affects our native species. The increasing rise and fall rates is increasing the amount of erosion and sedimentation in our rivers. And then that low frequency is creating dry rivers, or potentially anoxic or low oxygen conditions within those rivers during certain periods of the year. Something that we're not going to get into deeply today, but is the comparison of the human impacts of some of these changed flow regimes on humans and how we move through society. So all those same factors in river flooding. These are the 100-year floodplains for some of our urban rivers around Birmingham. Village Creek to the north, and then kind of trailing off on the left side of the screen is Valley Creek. And then other human impacts would be the pluvial flooding. So the flooding that happens far away from rivers, that is due to, the undersized infrastructure that was put into place nearly 100 years ago. creates a lot of flooded streets, interrupted transport and travel. And a lot of this can be tied back to some of the dense imperviousness in some of these urban areas, and then also deferred maintenance throughout the life of those stormwater infrastructure features. So we're not going to talk again too much about the human impacts, but it doesn't take a whole lot of distant memory to recall some of the human impacts that have happened in the Birmingham Metro area just in the last 5 years. Some loss of life, some damage to critical infrastructure, hospitals, transmission lines, things like that. That is happening due to the land use, land cover change in some of these urban watersheds, which really drives home the importance of not just construction stormwater management, but dealing with stormwater management kind of throughout the life of development. So I'm going to move us on to talking about some of the work that the Nature Conservancy and our partners are doing to deal with some of these post-construction stormwater management, to implement nature-based solutions for the benefit of some of those species in those strategic habitat units. This is going to be specifically around the Birmingham Metro area, but just know that there are projects and locations going on around the state that we're implementing projects similar to these in Alabama. So I'm going to start with the Birmingham Metro. Village Creek, again, is that northern creek. The first project I'm going to start with is something we did right here in our backyard at the Nature Conservancy office. Installed a rainwater harvesting system and bioretention, along with some other features that limit our stormwater impacts from our site that can hopefully be used as a model for around Metro Birmingham. So because this is a conservation presentation, I would be remiss to not mention some of the focal species of why we are doing this work in this location. Because again, where we work is always tied back to the species or the habitat that drives our biodiversity numbers. So, primary on this list is probably front and center, the watercress darter, one of the endemic fish species that we have here in Alabama that's found nowhere else. And this particular darter is found in just 4 or 5 locations in Metro Birmingham. It looks like it belongs in a saltwater aquarium because it's so colorful and bright, but this thing persists in very urban streams. So that's part of why we're focusing some effort here. And then, other species in this Village Creek Locust Fork connection are the black warrior water dog, a gilled salamander that exists in the Black Warrior watershed, and then also the flattened musk turtle. All of these are either state or federally listed as threatened or endangered. So there's a high importance of conserving these species and making sure that they don't experience additional habitat loss that might drive these species to extinction. So back to the project. In 2019, the Nature Conservancy purchased a building near downtown Birmingham in the Village Creek watershed. It is a primarily impervious surface with a little bit of barren land off to the side that could be used as a loading dock or a otherwise parking area. Instead of establishing this as a fully impervious parking space, the Nature Conservancy decided it wanted to offset a lot of its stormwater inputs, and so instead converted a lot of the building to best management practices that would help deal with some of this urban runoff. So some of the features include a 4,400-gallon cistern that captures runoff from the rooftop, a dry riverbed which leads to a bioretention system or a rain garden that helps infiltrate a lot of that runoff along its path, a gravel permeable parking area for a reduced number of cars, and then additional native species revegetation around the building to help further absorb some of the stormwater runoff coming from our parcel. This is what some of that looks like. This is the cistern that leads to the dry riverbed, which leads to the bioretention, which you can see active in this photo. Water is infiltrating across this site pretty much everywhere it flows until the ground is saturated. And that has led to an approximately 64% reduction in runoff volume from a modeled 2-inch rainfall scenario. So when it rains 2 inches, we are reducing our runoff by approximately 17,500 gallons as compared to before we implemented all these best management practices. Now, what we've learned from a couple of years at this site and a couple of years of production of our native plant system and the features that go along with it is that we accounted for our own runoff pretty well. What we didn't account for was that we're at the bottom of a bowl in our neighborhood, and we didn't account for the about 5 acres of impervious surface to our north that drains to our site, which has created some additional upkeep and maintenance, replacing mulch, replacing plants on occasion, doing some cleanup of some of our gravel areas after some of the large storms. But for most of the storms that fall throughout the year, our system is working very well. Our hope is to replicate this system throughout the watershed. Once again, it's doing a really great job on our small site, but it's having very little impact on the overall flow regime and habitat quality of the watershed. And so our hope with doing this is that we can blanket these types of practices around the city, around the watershed, to really move the needle on flow, on hydrology, and water quality in Village Creek for the protection of the watercress darter, flattened musk turtle, etc. As we move northeast, we move into St. Clair County. This is in the Big Canoe Creek watershed. Again, this drains to the Middle Coosa. This is in Springville, Alabama, which is a fast-growing population, fast-developing municipality because it's within commuting distance of both Birmingham and Gadsden. And so they're seeing a big influx of development. So one of the reasons we work here is because of, again, the species that exist here. Another darter species, this is the tri-spot darter, which is found only in the Coosa watershed in Alabama and Georgia. A very sensitive, small 2-inch fish that lives in small cold water spring-fed streams, but then also some freshwater mussels that are exceedingly rare, the Coosa moccasin shell being one of the rarest species in North America, exist in this Big Canoe Creek watershed. And so by protecting this watershed from additional sediment inputs, additional hydrology changes, we're protecting these filter feeding species that actually provide ecosystem services of their own in the terms of filtration by making sure that their habitat and their water quality needs are met. So the first project is a stormwater management project. There is a youth sports complex on the edge of town that has been developed to accommodate the changing population and the changing needs of that population. And as this site has grown and been developed with this large parking lot that you're seeing on the left, it has eroded some of the historic infrastructure that existed there. So this is a ditch off of the side of a stormwater conveyance off of the side of the parking lot that is, deeply eroded, sends tons and tons of sediment into left prong of Little Canoe Creek every single year, every single rainstorm. And so the Nature Conservancy and the city of Springville have teamed up to deal with this with a series of nature-based solutions that should limit the stormwater and sedimentation of that creek. And I'll show a few more photos, but it starts in that photo that was just showing adding check dams and native plants along that conveyance with some additional regrading to stabilize that channel should both reduce erosion and also slow water down and allow it to infiltrate along its path. So that series of check dams actually will lead into this much wider conveyance area that is spring fed, that will be full of native vegetation, both plugs and seed, to slow that water down, to filter some of that water in case it is still carrying either sediment or pesticides or herbicides that may be sprayed around this sports complex, and then also provide additional habitat value through the trees and native plants that are growing up through this space. So all in all, the plan for this site is nature-based solutions in series to address pollutants of concern and habitat gaps around this creek, where historic management has not always been the most friendly to these species. You can see that this area has been sprayed or mowed far too close in the past. And so by adding some of these features and adding some of these conservation practices in this area, we hope to not only shift the biological and ecosystem services and benefits that come from this, but also shift the maintenance and operations mindset of municipal employees to have kind of that broader landscape level impact that we're looking for, so that our work isn't just project site by project site. It's more landscape level. Here's another view of that ditch where runoff from the parking lot reaches this conveyance and delivers gravel and sediment and other pollutants into this area. This is a look at the landscape architect design and planting plan for this site. Construction on this project is set to begin next month. And we have another project coming up later on in the slideshow that is going to be just before that project in sequential order, that will help maximize the benefits of this site. But native plants were chosen to, again, provide some of those ecosystem services benefits, but then also restore upland habitat. This is a community that desires to be pollinator friendly and a bee city USA. And so incorporating some of these native plant ideas instead of invasives or ornamentals in this area is just going to accelerate the pace of restoration on this site. Just across the parking lot, you can see the parking lot in the background there, but just across the parking lot is the actual stream bed itself, which has seen a lot of additional erosion with the development of this sports complex, which is directly impacting habitat of that Coosa clubshell and tri-spot darter, where just to the left where that stream is a near vertical bank that is sloughing off sediment into that creek pretty consistently. And so we've designed a floodplain bench restoration to allow that small creek to spread out across its shrunken floodplain a little bit, to spread some of that volume and velocity out, infiltrate back into the soil, and then expand the habitat quality for during flood events when those species need some refuge habitat to survive. Again, this will be repopulated with native understory and tree species that will help stabilize those banks, prevent erosion, and reduce the metric tonnage of sediment reaching this river. Historically, where you see this baseball field, a lot of this was the floodplain of this small creek that has now been developed. It will still be able to access that historic floodplain during those kind of act of God events, the big rainstorms. But during smaller rainstorms, instead of just continuing to erode the banks, now it will be able to spread over this green, smaller floodplain, and again, protect some of the habitat that exists within this creek. And construction on this project is set to begin early next month in September. We expect projects like this to take anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks to construct. And that's just with all the earth moving and structures that go in to restore the riffles that you can see kind of in yellow on that diagram. And the way that we do these things is not with traditional hard armoring where we're just throwing riprap down. We actually use a natural channel design principle to, again, mimic those nature-based, those ecosystem services that plants, that woody debris and root balls and root wads actually can provide in terms of habitat and stability, whereas traditional hard armoring sort of just deflects all that flood energy elsewhere within the watershed, either upstream, downstream, the adjacent bank across the stream, something like that. So with natural channel design, we have significantly more or increased ecological lift in terms of the habitat spaces within that, the usable spaces at all water levels that come from a natural channel design. And this is expected to grow in, larger trees, things like that. This photo on the right is, I believe, 1 year after the restoration was completed. So some of that the larger tree species that will be there eventually just haven't grown in yet, but we'll continue to fill in this space around this site. And then a third project at this same site is, just upstream of the photo we were recently looking at where this restoration is going to take place. Our partners at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service completed a barrier removal, this culvert. This is the before photo, but this culvert created disconnection in this little creek during low flow periods. It created what we call a perched culvert, where the water level below downstream of the culvert is not at the same elevation. So there's, a drain or a drip coming from the culvert, which a lot of these species cannot pass to get over that barrier. So they also create crossings like this, also create bottlenecks during high flow or flood events, causes extensive flooding upstream of this as it bottlenecks through this culvert, which makes this susceptible to erosion and collapse kind of throughout the year. So this is the after photo of this project. This is what's called a bottomless culvert. Obviously not a purely nature-based solution, but creating a bridge or a bottomless culvert like this over the top of the stream eliminates that disconnect during seasonal low flow, or reduces that disconnect during seasonal low flow. You can see extremely low flow here where just a little bit of water getting through there, but you're not getting the same amount of erosion because underneath this culvert, the river is still able to access its floodplains. It's able to spread out and puts a lot less pressure on this structure and the stabilization of that structure. So moving forward, there are things we can do, and the things that the Nature Conservancy and our partners like the city of Birmingham are doing to improve urban stormwater runoff and reduce impacts on some of these sensitive species. Some of the things that we can do that we know of are, more intentional site design and land conservation. So this is for new development where we're clearing land, undeveloped land to become developed land, being very intentional in that site design, not interfering with natural water courses, avoiding very steep slopes, condensing some of that development onto that parcel, and preserving the rest of that property can have a huge impact on our freshwater resources. Also using green infrastructure and nature-based solutions when possible. This is something that's becoming more common in local ordinances. Still not widespread adoption, but we are seeing more adoption of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, which will in turn have, hydrologic effects during, your average size rainstorms. And then using some of those nature-based solutions across the city. We've seen UAB, University of Alabama at Birmingham, do that with some of their commuter parking lots where they've installed bioswales between the parking spaces so that runoff from this large, expansive paved area is actually running into infiltrative trenches to reduce the volume and the poor quality of the runoff by filtering through those plants. And then the last thing we can really do is, or one of the last things we can really do is is increase and improve the regulatory controls that protect our freshwater resources. So that comes in the form of the permits that are issued, some of the ordinances and design standards that are in place to protect freshwater resources, design storms, storm sizes, requirements for green infrastructure, or approving why you can't do green infrastructure, things like that are expected to have a really big issue. One of those policies would be stormwater utility fees. In Alabama, fewer than 10 communities have established stormwater utility fees, which go towards the maintenance of old infrastructure and also the adoption of new innovative infrastructure in relation to stormwater. So most stormwater funds come out of the general fund and not a dedicated stormwater pot of money. And we lag behind a lot of our neighbors on this. There's over 100 municipalities or communities in Georgia that have stormwater utility fees, about half as many in Tennessee, 3 times as many down in Florida. So Alabama communities are just not generating the revenue needed to focus on stormwater issues, whether that's flooding and people and infrastructure protection or some of this natural resource conservation. Either way, those funds just aren't there for this type of work in Alabama. So some of that is legislatively dictated, some of that is locally dictated, but either way, this is an area where Alabama lags behind. And then, when we're not looking at, land conversions from undeveloped to developed, we can also go back and fix the past. So retrofitting stormwater infrastructure where it's either undersized or beyond its lifespan or doesn't exist at all. You may be familiar with the ASC report card on infrastructure around our country. 2021 was the first year that they included stormwater infrastructure in that report card. And some of the snippets from that report card in 2025, it's broadly known that Alabama's stormwater infrastructure has significantly exceeded its design life and doesn't incorporate the effects of climate change in the sizing or the durability of some of this infrastructure. So that's a big piece. Stormwater infrastructure in Alabama, needs an upgrade. It's got a D plus rating. The last 2 report cards that we've received. If you want to see the full report, if you haven't seen it, there's a QR code on the screen that I'll leave on there for just a moment. But it really does prescribe some of the potential fixes for our stormwater infrastructure that could be made here in Alabama. Fixing the past includes using nature-based solutions. We're piloting a few studies with our partners at the University of Alabama on using native river cane as a potential erosion control method along stream banks and as a habitat restoration for a lot of some of these nature-based solutions that we're trying to implement around the state. Other nature-based solutions include, some curb cut type rain gardens. So in the Birmingham Metro, in the city of Birmingham has instituted a few of these curb cut rain gardens that capture runoff flowing down this boulevard, where stormwater is able to enter these gardens, filter through the plants. Some of the sediment drops out before it actually reaches a true storm drain. So this was completed a little more than a year ago. So we're still learning the impact of these curb cut rain gardens. This is a pilot project at this point. Only about 8 of these have been installed, but the hope is that whenever we're tearing up a street to replace water lines or just to replace the street itself, what we put back has a greater impact on reducing stormwater runoff and the pollutants that it carries than what was there previously. Another part of fixing the past is naturalizing our floodplains and creating some off-channel flood storage where necessary. So we've done a lot of developing within floodplains in this country as a whole. where possible, it would be extremely beneficial to add either off-channel storage, either highly engineered off-channel storage, or just natural floodplains without homes and businesses and infrastructure. That water can spread out and soak into the ground. Without these types of features, we're just funneling more of that runoff or more of that flow downstream, which has the impact to affect houses and people more often. So two of the projects, there are two projects in design right now for off-channel storage on Valley Creek, 10 acres and 13.5 acres that would store a bunch of these floodwaters, before they reach homes and businesses. And then there's one that's very much in progress in the planning phase in FEMA floodplain buyout area that was bought out in the late 90s and early 2000s that still just sits as a vacant, almost deserted street that becomes a big dumping ground for contractors, for individuals, things like that. The hope is to design this approximately 100 acres within the urban environment to be a nature-based solution or a sponge that can help deal with some of the floodwaters that come up in this area. And you can see some of that in the photos, but it's underutilized as a method or a strategy for reducing the impacts of stormwater runoff and flooding. Here's just some of the preliminary designs of daylighting some of those streams, enhancing current low areas to act as floodplain wetlands that can help store and infiltrate some of that water, used as open water habitats for migratory birds and things like that, and provide a real green space asset for the communities that still live nearby. And then the last feature of fixing the past would be doing some of that stream bank stabilization using natural channel design to reduce that sediment loading that we're seeing in rivers, to reduce the impact on some of our most rare species or our most special species that really make Alabama unique in its biodiversity. That will not persist if we continue to allow the amounts of sediment to reach those streams as we currently are or have been in the past. And simple practices like not mowing to the edge of this extremely eroded riverbank could start to regrow some of the roots here, but true stabilization and natural channel design is kind of the fastest method to get us there. I'm gonna cut it off right there and leave some time for questions. I will be down in Orange Beach next week for the Alabama Water Resources Conference, the annual conference. I'd love to catch up with folks or talk more in detail about some of the projects that we're working on. But I'm open to some questions, and I appreciate your time.
All right, thank you, Ben. That was very engaging. I'll also be at the at Orange Beach next week, so I'll see you there.
Yeah.
Right now, we're gonna open the webinar to guests. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A tab. If you have any questions for Ben, go ahead and submit your questions there. We have a little bit of time here at the end for Ben to answer them in person. Before everyone runs away to continue with their day, I want to thank everybody for attending. We will be sending out a follow-up email in the next couple days with instructions on how to get your PDH for attending. And then this webinar will also be recorded and we'll post it onto our YouTube. But let's open the floor up for any questions. And then just a reminder, if you can use the question and answer tab at the bottom, I see a question came in through the regular chat. We can answer it there too, but it's easier for everybody if you put in the question and answer section. All right, Ben, looks like our first question came in. Can you see that?
Oh yeah, there we go. So the question is, have we or anyone else found incentives for developers to use more of these nature-based designs instead of basic detention or retention? There are examples across the US of incentive programs that can incentivize nature-based and green infrastructure type designs and developments. They're not widely used here in Alabama at this point. One of the things that we are working on, and some of the projects that I showed you are direct examples of this, is one of the assets that the Nature Conservancy and we partner often with Auburn on this, is writing grants to help offset the costs of some of these nature-based solutions, nature-based designs. And so we can often bring a few of those incentives with us to municipalities, to developers, to pilot some of these projects and really provide a proof of concept. And then in our rural freshwater program, my counterpart, Elena Reynolds, does a great job of working through Farm Bill and Natural Resource Conservation Service programs to really incentivize stream bank stabilization and culvert replacement, low water crossings, things like that through the Farm Bill to further incentivize rural landowners to do that. We haven't quite nailed the funding model for the urban environment. It's kind of piecemeal at this point, but we're working on exactly that. And if you have suggestions, I'm more than open to finding ways to incentivize this, either through municipal policy or external grants or any other source. Yeah, thank you.
Well, we'll give everybody else a few more minutes here, give them a chance to type up any questions they may have. As y'all can see on the bottom left corner of Ben's screen, there's also his email address. If you do have any questions after the webinar is done, I'm sure Ben would be happy to answer any questions that you might think up of and then send to him via email. All righty. Well, looks like that might be it for questions. Again, if y'all do have any questions, please do reach out to Ben or myself, and I'll forward the questions over to Ben. Ben, I want to thank you again for your time today. Thank you for presenting, and everybody who attended, thank you for joining. As I mentioned, you should be getting a follow-up email with instructions on how to get your PDH. Looks like we had a final question come in really quick here.
Yeah, so the question from Craig is, I know the Nature Conservancy has an agreement with NRCS to help revive the Paint Rock River in Northeast Alabama. Are there any agreements TNC has with other government organizations for urban areas? We do work through NRCS up in the Paint Rock. We also work with NRCS in the Locust Fork and Big Canoe Creek watersheds. We do not have specific agreements with NRCS other than, to continue to implement best management practices on some of those agricultural lands, livestock producers, agricultural producers, things like that. Unfortunately, we don't have large scale agreements in the same way in urban areas, but we do work closely with municipalities to help them provide technical assistance, provide some of the funding for designs or implementation of some of these projects. So those two projects that I mentioned up in Springville, we're working directly with the city of Springville for those. Some of our grant funds helped to pay for the design of those projects. And then Springville's role is to carry the burden of implementation of those programs. So continued collaboration throughout the process, but kind of a shared funding or shared agreement model with those areas. But in terms of state and federal agency collaborations like that, we're still working on that model for some of our urban stormwater type projects. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again, Ben. Everybody, we're going to go ahead and close down this webinar if there aren't any other questions. But again, you can see Ben's email in the bottom left corner. Thank you all again for joining, and keep your eyes on your inbox for a follow-up email with instructions on how to get your PDH. All righty, everybody have a good day.
Thanks, folks.